I think entertainment itself is not wrong. An overindulgence in entertainment, I think, is wrong. Yep. But entertainment, the idea of having fun, isn't wrong. But I think that using of, again, exploring, like you said, spiritual themes like possession and conversion and this kind of stuff in a setting that's totally different is a good way for the artist to think about the thing and also think about the value of the art on the self of how does the art not just help you depict
but how does
beauty
it
and
help
truth,
shape you?
but how does it help shape you in the very doing of the thing.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Artists of the Way. Today, I'm John. I always forget to introduce myself. I'm John, the host, and today we have our guest, John Taylor. So, two Johns. I hope that's not too confusing. But John is a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. He has a Masters in Theology with an emphasis on ministry in multi-ethnic communities. And he currently works at Crosswinds Church in Wyoming through his residency at Calvary Church here in Grand Rapids. John and I have done some shows together before. He's a great lover of art and story, and also a really sharp theological mind. And so I wanted to just have him on and chat about the importance of art to Christians and kind of what that means for us. So how are you doing, John?
I'm doing well.
Good.
It is still a little smoky outside. I was hoping the storm would drive it all away. But
yes, I woke up today and I couldn't see anything, and I was like, I really hope this is fog and
it's
not
less
the smoke.
smoky, but it's still a little smoky.
Mm-hmm. We'll get there. Cool. So I'm going to start with two questions that I ask everybody on the podcast. And you don't work on art as frequently as some of my other guests, so your answers might be different, but we'll see. The questions are, first, what are you working on right now? And then second, how has God been using art in your life recently?
So let's see. Are we talking artistically? What am I working on right now? Because
yeah. If you don't have anything artistic.
Yeah, not really anything. I've been doing a lot of ministry stuff.
What are you working on ministerially?
We had a very busy month. We had a VBS at our church and a kids club camp, which was kind of an all-day thing. And those were both happening. And
at the same time?
No.
Okay, I was like...
One was 1 week, one was a separate week.
They're like, let's do VBS, which is an all-day thing, and then another kids thing that's an all-day thing.
The funny thing was, VBS wasn't an all-day thing for us. Camp was an all-day thing. VBS was just 2 hours.
Oh, was it like an evening VBS?
It was an evening VBS, yeah.
Nice.
So that's one thing I've been doing. We did some art in there.
Tell us about that. What was that like?
So we have puppets, and we had a puppet stage, and the puppet stage was actually fire. The painting was super good. Nice. It was Western themed, and the painting of the cowboy on the puppet stage was just really good.
Nice. What did it tell you about life and existence?
So here's the funny thing. Let's actually just go into this. Let's go into I have the questions here.
How's art been?
How has God been using art in your life recently?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'm going to be expanding the traditional view of art on this podcast. But
how dare you not add to this thousands of years of a discussion?
But I've been playing a lot of Red Dead Redemption lately.
Yes!
And
love that game.
I don't know if we've had on this podcast the complicated and nuanced discussion of are video games art? Yes.
Here we go to all my audience members that totally have never played a video game. We're going to talk about why video games are art today.
I don't think we're going to talk about that, but I've been playing Red Dead Redemption. It is actually kind of this is weird, but riding around a video game landscape on a horse. I was like, man, heaven's going to be cool.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's just, they do such a good job, and I think it's a beautiful artistic representation of just the area of the United States that they're capturing in that game. And when you're riding through it, just the way they've rendered it, the way that they've modeled it and built it and lit it and everything just feels so serene.
Yeah, it wasn't even like any of the story elements of the game, which is it's a great game.
The name redemption is literally in the title.
It is. But it was literally just like riding around, like hunting in the game, where I'm like looking at the landscapes and it's like, man, heaven's gonna be cool.
Well, I can't, because I mean, I'm like, we're getting a new heaven and a new earth, and if this is what he came up with on his first go around, imagine when he like renews everything.
I had a pastor in high school who would always say, you got to think about it this way: God created this heaven and this earth in 7 days. Okay, he's been working on the current one for like 6,000 years, or the new one for like 6,000 years. It's probably gonna be better. That's all I'm saying.
Yep. Yeah, that's gonna be great. Cool. So I feel like there's a lot of different views on art in the Christian world, and I think, I feel like a lot of times in evangelical circles, at least, the question sometimes just gets reduced to what should we partake in and what shouldn't we partake in. If you're on more like the
conservative.
Yeah, and like the I'm blanking on the word, moralistic kind of.
Sure. Yeah. Side of things, yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I want to unpack a little bit more with you. What are the different nuances to art for Christians, both the good and the bad? I thought we could start by just asking, is there value in art to Christians? And particularly, is there value to art that's not made by Christians for Christians?
I would say yes. My example, I don't know that the people at Rockstar Studios, they famously...
The developers of Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, the Grand Theft Auto,
Christian.
And I'm thinking they don't have a overtly Christian bent to them. But I think there is value of non-Christian art for Christians. I actually have a coworker, he's not there anymore, who basically argued that, like, at their core, all stories are Christian unless they are, like, explicitly anti-Christian. I don't know that I necessarily agree with him.
Right.
But
what was his, like, reasoning there?
Essentially, his reasoning was pretty much all stories have the through line of embetterment, right? Not all of them, but the vast majority of stories involve a person becoming better, or bettering a situation, or bettering others, or that's the vast majority of stories. I think we can agree on that point. And his whole point was, like, if God is real, and he is the real author of goodness and truth, any presentation of a person becoming better is in some way them becoming more conforming to what God would want for the world.
Okay.
So not like, he's not saying all Christian stories are explicitly Christian.
Right.
But all this idea that, like, all stories...
There's some reflective part of that in it.
And I think he might even argue non-Christian stories and stories that have downward arcs will reflect the reality of sin in the human condition, in the human life. So that in itself is conforming to and confirming a Christian understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Back to the main question, is there value for art in a Christian's life? I think there definitely is. I think non-Christian or Christian art expresses beauty, which is an almost irreducible thing about God, that God is inherently beautiful, and humans will ultimately crave beauty in some sense. So you can make an argument. I think I'm taking this from Love, Justice, Beauty. I can't remember who the author of that is at this point. But he basically argues that all human pursuits of love, justice, and beauty are ultimately pursuits that are somewhat Godward facing and just need to be redirected if they are towards the wrong thing, and that they are things that are inherently, we'll say, Godward in their motion, even if they're not leading the person specifically to God. So I think that very thing can do it. I also think, I actually looked it up before I got here, there's a couple different times where Paul uses a non-Christian poet, and Paul, or in the book of John, the high priest says this thing about, isn't it better for one man to die for the sins of the whole nation? And John specifically, as the narrator says, he didn't realize it, but God was prophesying through him.
I love that part. Yeah.
About concerning the death of Jesus. So I think this idea that non-Christians can be used by God, or non-Christian works can be used by God in the life of a believer or a non-believer to affect his will is very clear and present. Like that poet, he's a good art example. A poet in Paul's example was not writing about, and to be fair, what he said isn't exactly all that nice, because he's talking about how whoever it is are lazy cretins and all that kind of stuff. But God can use this message from a non-Christian to push forward a true and ultimately God-honoring thing. Yeah. So I think there is God-honoring that can happen as a result of non-Christian art and Christian art.
Right.
That one feels fairly inherent, so it didn't feel like it was overly needing to be addressed.
Yeah. Is there a point where you would draw the line, where you would say at this point, I think that this is inherently harmful for a believer, or do you think that that's more down to the individual?
Sure,
like
I think
the Holy Spirit?
I think there certainly is, for both. I'll say for both the believer and the individual believer, so generically and individually. I think there is a real case of these things could lead to sin in the partaking of them, or could be kind of sin themselves in the making of them. In, like, if you had a person who, let's say, drew a graphic novel that depicted them like violently murdering their own family, I think you could realistically argue that this is no longer some sense of like punching the pillow, getting your anger out therapy, and has become kind of a violent fantasization where this person is now intentionally engaging with their anger and their bitterness, and in not a way that will lead to proper healing. Even if it leads to some closure, it's probably not the God-honoring way to go about it. And the same thing could be said with sexual things or demonic things. I have a rule. I'm a big board game fan and video game fan, and I kind of have a soft rule that I'm fine with violence in video games. Sex a little less so. But I have a pretty hard and fast rule that I don't work with demons, even in a fictional media. It's just not something I do. So even I'm fine with killing them.
So Doom, you're like,
yeah. If we're talking like a H.P. Lovecraft game where I'm going and killing all these things, don't have a problem with that. I have no problem with Doom, going out killing demons. But once I'm beginning to ally with them and work with them, that's when I draw a line. Just because it's something that I think even in fiction is not wise to do. Yeah,
because you don't know what you're messing with.
Yeah, right, because demons are real. Whereas like XCOM, no problem killing aliens or even partnering with aliens, because aliens aren't real.
Right.
Maybe I'll offend a bunch of people, but aliens, at least of that sort.
The majority of my audience are big alien supporters.
They're not real, right? So like that kind of stuff doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But demons are real. So that kind of stuff I just think is unwise. So I think engaging in it with the individual, kind of gauging, can an individual watch a horror movie, right? Where there's kind of these graphic depictions of violence. I think it depends. I don't think it's inherently wrong, especially because for the most case, these graphic depictions of violence aren't viewed as a positive thing, right? In most horror movies, the killer's the bad guy.
Yeah.
But I think for some people, it might just be kind of traumatizing and fear-inducing in a way that's I don't think fear is inherently bad.
Right.
But
we're not supposed to have a spirit of fear.
Yeah, and I think this kind of, like, if you had a really, I think there's a big difference between kind of the suspense-driven, you know what I'm talking about, and a genuine, like, this is causing me to be a more fearful person in my life.
Like I'm walking down the street and now I don't trust anybody.
Yeah, like, I think if that's,
or whatever.
Yeah, like, if that's happening, I think you're in a problem. If it's just you, like, hey, I think the suspense and the psychology is interesting, I think it's probably fine.
I'm curious about your thoughts on an artist making art that maybe in their motive, it's not a sinful thing. Like maybe it's in like a gray area. So like, I don't know, what I think about is like a lot of classical paintings where there's just naked people out there, you know, and I don't think that the artists were doing that with like pornographic intentions, but that the people could definitely look at that, you know. And so I'm curious about your thoughts ethically as an artist. Is that something that they have to think about, is could my art cause somebody to sin even if their motives in making it are pure and like God honoring and God pointed?
Sure. I think there's a yes and a no, because I think we'll stick with that. The Renaissance artists who are all at least officially Christians and working for the church and that kind of stuff. I think in this case there's kind of a distinct difference between sexuality and nudity. Though I think it could result in problems for people. I think there's a wisdom to be had in kind of abstaining in these things, especially if you know your people, or abstaining in how broadly you disseminate them. In terms of like, those Renaissance painters couldn't have disseminated that. I mean, they're on they're on the ceilings and walls of cathedrals that are public to view. But like, I think there's and I think I understand, an artistic kind of reflex that everything I do in some sense need to be shared.
Right.
Which I think I understand, but at the same time, if it's not healthy for the people you'll be sharing with, it's probably not wise or kind to do so. Yeah. I think to some degree you have to say, hey, I am not in control of everyone. And what they choose to look at and view is on them. So it's a both and, but I think it shouldn't stop you from doing anything, because I think you might be able to make an argument that you almost can't do anything if someone might sin because of it, because you could have a photography session of an attractive woman who is fully clothed, and some guy might have trouble with it, right? But I think at the same time, doing things that are closer to those, I know people have problems with this. I know this specifically is a trigger for many people, or even a few people, is where you kind of have to have wisdom on, should I do it? And if I do it, how widely should I spread it?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, I feel like we're kind of looking at the negative side. I want to switch to the positive side in a minute here, but idolatry in art. Because I know I definitely, so I've got like sort of this dual call to art and ministry, and I've always felt God never letting me fully commit to one or the other, but art especially, I always feel that danger of, man, I could really just make this my everything and make it the main thing. But I also know that has been used at times for people to, like, in an unhealthy or more toxic church environment, to like prevent them from even engaging in that. What are your thoughts on art as idolatry? Just brought, like, the being a part of art.
I mean, can art be a source of idolatry? Yes. That's non-debatable, right? Because virtually anything can be a source of idolatry. Putting anything before God is idolatry, so anything can be anything. I'll get back to like the iconoclasm and icons question
Yes.
in a bit, but I think there is a challenge for it, and I think a lot of it comes down to identity, in the sense of, are you, in your mind, if you're a Christian artist, are you a Christian artist, or are you an artist who is a Christian? In the sense of, is your Christianity, your commitment, and your identity in Christ,
Is that the first thing?
is that the first thing?
Right.
Does that come over your artisticness, or is it, I'm an artist first and foremost, and then that I am also a Christian,
Right.
But essentially, the point here is, like, you have to understand your identity in Christ, and if these two things come into conflict, right?
Right.
Hey, I want to work on this project. I feel like I should do this, but I feel like it's not moral. Do you do it or you not?
Yeah. And you're not saying, because I know, like, especially in the music world, there's the, like, differentiation of, oh, I'm a Christian musician, or I'm a musical artist who is also a Christian, and that's present in my works. But you're not saying, oh, you have to specifically do Christian art.
Absolutely.
But,
yeah. We're not saying every painting you have to be is a crucifix and all that kind of stuff.
This is my 80th crucifix.
Yeah,
I've done the last variation I think I can do.
If you want to do a crucifix, won one art prize, right? They can be beautiful. But I think there's a real reality of, not everything you have to do needs to be a painting of Paul, or on the contrast, you never ever do a painting of Jesus. We'll get into might get into that later.
Yeah.
But I think there's so I'm not saying everything you need to do needs to be Christian explicitly in the artwork.
Right.
But
everything needs to be submitted.
Everything needs to be submitted to that Christian identity of it. Yeah, it's not, will someone see this drawing and immediately come to Christ? No. But is there a reality of, will people look at the body of the art and each individual art piece and be drawn closer to God? Even in a non-specific way, right? I mean, it's what I was talking about. Depictions of nature are not, there is nothing inherently Christian about going out and painting a mountainside. But there's also nothing that would be offensive to God to it, as long as it's submitting to, this is the flip side of everything could be, right? Everything could be idolatrous even a painting of Jesus could be idolatrous if you're doing it for the purpose of showing off your own skills as a painter and getting glory to yourself. If you've read the book The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, there's a whole discussion in that between two artists, where one artist is discussing, so if you don't know the book, this is probably important. It's about people in heaven. They're in heaven. Some of them are heaven dwellers, we'll say, they belong in heaven. Some of them are not, but they've been invited essentially there to look around. And they meet people that they know while they're there. And one guy is an artist, and he has a colleague. And the guy who's there visiting is like, man, I really love to paint this country. The other guy's like, great, that's fantastic, but why? And he was like, well, I really just want to show off and examine the colors. And he's like, that's the wrong reason.
Right.
And he's like, there's nothing against paint up. Like, we have paint up here. You can paint.
Right.
But is the reason to ultimately glorify God? I don't think he says that explicitly in the book. But is that it,
well,
or
I
is
think,
it?
Because we're doing that scene in the acting class. I think he says something about like the paintings and everything that you did was really just meant to be like a reflection and a like preview to what's coming, and like a window that God is seen through.
So at one point they're talking about painting, and he's like, well, your kind of painting there's no need for here, because everything, like, you originally painted scenes with light and this kind of stuff, and everything you were painting back then was just a kind of picture of what's actually here. So the painting that you've done is irrelevant,
right?
And you have to change how you do these kind of things.
So for the artist, it's almost, well, for anybody, I would say, it's running through your own Abraham and Isaac scenario of, if God tells you, there's a point to move on from this.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you willing to do that? Not that he necessarily will, because he probably designed you with that in mind, but if he does at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big it. And I think I'll move on now. I think we've covered that. I want to move on to the kind of icon question.
So just to explain that to anybody in the audience that doesn't know the term, excuse me, there are some theological circles. I don't know which specific denominations do and don't believe it, but there's a theological view that depicting the divine, like God or Christ, and like sometimes saints and things like that, is in and of itself idolatrous or not right, because you might be worshiping that thing instead of God. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
So when it comes to idolatry in art, we'll go with icons and discuss this. First thing I want to say is they're only talking about a certain type of art, right? Because like music has been consistently a part of the church since the early church. There's people have maybe disagreed on, are you allowed to use electric guitars or that kind of stuff. No one, as far as I'm aware, has ever said the church shouldn't have music because that's idolatrous and it's art. I mean, it's literally in the text of praising God with spiritual songs and psalms and this kind of like that is a non-issue. Well, maybe not a non-issue, but it is provable and non-debatable that the church throughout history has always used music. So when we're talking art, especially with icons, we're specifically talking about paintings and that kind of medium, sometimes sculptures, that normally depict Jesus. There's kind of two sides to this. Jesus or saints that could be more recent saints, or it could be like the Apostle Paul is a saint. In the, we'll not get into what saints means, but in the like icon understanding of saints, they're talking about like the classical saints,
people that they have sainted, not saints as the general term for the church.
So I'll take this in two slides. I think there's some people, and I understand it, I don't agree with it, but I understand the viewpoint that say, hey, you shouldn't make an image of Jesus. And I think with this one, it tends to be less, we're concerned about you worshiping this thing. And it tends to be, hey, the second commandment says you're not supposed to make a graven image of God.
Right.
And I understand that viewpoint. And some people hold it, and I don't think they're in the wrong for holding it. I do disagree with them. And the reason I disagree with them is in the Old Testament, we have some anthropomorphic depictions of God, right? We have God having hands or God having, a head or whatever.
And he describes himself in those terms.
He describes himself in those terms. But God, those are metaphors and terminologies, right? Or they become real when God has a theophany. That's when God comes to earth in the image of a person. But those are
a wrestling match.
For a wrestling match, or to have a talk with Abraham. He does a couple times in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But those are not the actual form of God. That is God just kind of putting on a human suit, right? The difference with Jesus, and why I think personally it's acceptable and okay to make pictures of Jesus, is we didn't make Jesus in the image of man when Jesus came to earth. God did. Right? God was the one who, God the Father will say, and God the Son. God the Son comes into Mary as a virgin, is born as a real human. So when I depict Jesus in a drawing or in a painting, I am not putting onto God characteristics that he doesn't have. Now, maybe if someone wanted to say you shouldn't draw God the Father because he doesn't have a characteristic, I think I could hear an argument for that. I might even agree with them. But with Jesus, the implication that Jesus has legs and hands and a head and a face isn't a depiction of Jesus. It's a historical fact of Jesus. And now I don't know what that looks like. And we can have some argument and some discussion on, should we think about kind of race and features and that kind of stuff?
How important is that?
How important is that? And how do we think about that? And how do those things teach? And how do we teach with those things? Is another discussion. But the idea that I can draw a picture of Jesus as a human isn't attributing any attributes to God that he doesn't actually have. Because God the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, actually is a human. He came to earth as an actual human. He's still an actual human now. So when I depict Jesus with a body, that is not taking an earthly thing and applying it to God. That is taking a thing that God has done and depicting it.
Okay. Now I want to ask you a specific question adjacent to that. As an actor who's played Jesus before,
yeah.
I'm every time I think, because I'm with you. I think that it's there's nothing inherently wrong with that depicting Christ artistically, but playing the character, I'm like, is that a little more high stakes? Because the actor's job is to interpret what the script is, and so I am interpreting and kind of adding my understanding and emotion to Jesus in that sense. I don't know. I'm just curious about your thoughts on the theological ethics of that.
Yeah. So I think it is another depiction of Jesus, right? And again, I think we're in the clear here because Jesus actually has a body and actually has done things.
Still has a body, crazily.
Who?
Jesus.
Yeah, still has a body. Yeah, currently has a body and will always have a body, a human physical body. So I think in these depictions, I think inherently it's not wrong. You're never going to be a perfect depiction of Jesus. Neither is anyone else, for the inherent fact that you're sinful and Jesus is not. So I think I like actually the term you said, high stakes, because it kind of goes with the teaching in a different form. So Scripture is pretty clear that teachers, those who regularly teach the church, are held to a higher standard in their teaching because their ideas about Jesus are no longer just their own, but they're shaping other people's understanding of Jesus. So if I have a wrong depiction of Jesus personally, that's not great, but it's not necessarily going to affect anyone else. If I, as a pastor, get up and preach wrongly about Jesus, now I have 100 people who have a wrong understanding of Jesus because of something that I've said. I think acting can be the same way. I think it's less high stakes because you are not teaching in the same capacity that Scripture's talking about in that passage.
Might still because I've had conversations where people have been like, the way that you played that character is now it's part of their sort of the way they've started to view Christ just because that was a performance they saw and things impacted them.
Yeah, I mean,
and so now moving forward, they see how that connects to Scripture. But then it's like, is my performance bearing the weight of some of their Christological interpretation?
I can give an example. Step away from Jesus for a second. Yeah. I saw Wicked with Megan down in Dallas. Megan's my wife. Down in Dallas when it was a traveling show, and it was not the original cast, right? And in my mind, I had never seen it before. I'd never listened to the music. I mean, I listened to a few of the songs, but I hadn't listened to most of it. I had no idea what the show was. I knew the basic premise, but I didn't know what actually happened. And in my mind, those characters, especially the Alphaba, is quote unquote like the in my mind that's the way she is correctly played.
Right.
And then I go and listen to other versions or watch other versions, and in my mind, these other versions where they differ from the Alphaba I first saw, they're incorrect.
Right.
Even though, I know from the bulk body, there's one part of the Alphaba that I think is still correct in my mind. I know, based on all the other comparisons, she's the one that is the abnormal. Like, the thing she did was different than everyone else.
Yep.
In my mind, she's still right and they're still wrong. So you have to be really careful with this depiction, with this teaching, because if someone gets an understanding of Jesus from your depiction that's inaccurate, that can be something they have to work through and be difficult. And I think it varies because you've played Jesus twice.
Only once.
Only
I'd love
once.
to play
only
him
once.
again
Only
if
once.
the
Okay.
Lord gives me that chance.
So we'll go with that because you played him in Cotton Patch.
Yep.
Cotton Patch is a little bit distinct because I think the further you step away from a
purely scriptural
in a purely intended to be kind of a one-for-one thing, the more I would hope an audience member will understand
that it's an interpretive lens.
That's an interpretive lens and a difference. So, like, right, Jesus in Cotton Patch Gospel
is a white dude in the South.
He's a white dude in South America, right? And I think most Christians will correctly understand it, and that won't shape anything. Like, if Jesus in your mind speaks in a Southern accent because you heard them with Cotton Patch, I think that's more on
I hope not.
I think that's more on you not understanding storytelling, allegory, than it's on the person depicting Jesus.
Right.
When you get something closer to, let's say, like Jonathan Rumi in The Chosen, he is depicting Jesus as
Jesus
kind of well as he can, as Jesus quote unquote was, right? He's walking around a model of the Israelite cities. He's doing all these kind of things. And for that kind of role, the closer it is, the kind of less, I'll say, narrative protection you have.
Right.
In that you really want to get it kind of tight because you can get more of those wrong things in, and less of it can be explained by, well, this is kind of the story. Like Jesus, again, Cotton Patch Castle, Jesus wasn't actually lynched. And the story's lynched because it makes sense
in the context
in the context of that of that story. But I think most audience members will correctly understand what is going on.
Right.
If Jesus in The Chosen was lynched,
then that would be a problem.
It's a big problem because it's meant to be a much more realistic depiction.
Right.
I
feel like that might almost be a burden that I feel like I'm getting really niche now with storytelling and theater and stuff.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's a burden that almost, especially the director, but like the whole cast has. Like, it's not just the person playing Jesus who's carrying that, because an audience member could see a reaction to Jesus from an audience member and then infer something about Jesus' character that then maybe affects how they're viewing him in reality.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's almost like a group effort to make sure you're as faithful as you can be in following God's leading in that, because you're never going to 100%
and again,
get
in
there,
the narrative format that you're working with,
right?
I think there is an obviously wrong thing if you're playing Jesus, depicting Jesus. If you intentionally depict Jesus in an inaccurate way,
right,
that's not just due to the storytelling bent of it. But I can't remember what the show is. There's currently a show where Jesus and disciples are like gay or whatever. This is an intentional distortion, and is wrong. It would be wrong to act in because you're participating in it, and it was wrong to write because it's an intentional distortion of Jesus. So if you did a story where Jesus was violently assaulting people,
right,
this is no
believe.
Right. This is no longer a narrative change of setting and kind of, I mean, this is kind of what the whole Chronicles of Narnia was, right? It was a big narrative change. If Aslan had been a violent murderer, the Narnia books would not be a good
allegory.
I mean, we'll discuss. We won't discuss, but I don't think the Narnia books are allegory. I want to put that out officially. But it wouldn't be a good kind of representation of Jesus,
right,
if he had him doing things that Jesus wouldn't do even in another setting, right? Again, when you have Jesus wearing, you wore like a tie-dye t-shirt or whatever in that show, that's fine because that is taking something that, again, it's just transporting what if Jesus was in another setting. What do we think he would do? Wearing modern-day clothing is fine in a modern-day setting because Jesus wore modern-day clothing of his day.
Right.
Like, we don't think that Jesus was wearing anything particularly strange.
It's more just like, as an actor, trying to make sure the decisions you're making on stage and how you're playing it is as faithful as you can be.
Yes. Yeah. Are you doing it in good faith? Are you genuinely trying to be faithful?
Yeah.
Or are you once you intentionally distort, you're in
and then
a bad place.
And like going back to our earlier discussion, even if you are being as faithful as you can, somebody might get something weird from it. Yeah. But then at that point, you've done everything that you can to be faithful to God and follow his leading in that.
Yeah.
Cool.
There's only half the discussion on icons.
Right.
The other half has to do with depictions of
saints,
holy people, stories from the Bible, that kind of stuff. Is there a danger of those? Are those a problem? So I think, like all things, like I said, there can be a danger of idolatry. It could be the case that people could look at St. Paul, and some of this comes down to your beliefs on whether or not you should pray to saints and stuff,
Right.
which we won't discuss here. It's just not the space. But this could lead to a worship of a sainted person rather than Jesus. I don't think those things are inherently the case. So I don't think icons are wrong. I don't know if we have a question about this later on, but there is a reality of history that says for a lot of the Middle Ages, art, icons, stained glass, mosaics were all super important for teaching the Bible because you had...
It was like a pictorial tradition.
Yes, you had illiterate people or weakly literate people who could read the Bible, let alone the fact that for a long time the Bible was kept in Latin.
Yep.
So an average English farmer couldn't read it even if he could read. Being able to look at a pictorial tradition. So being able to look at a picture of Jesus wrestling God helped him to know about the story and learn about the story and ask about the story. And same thing with people throughout church history. So if you saw a painting of St. Augustine, you'd be able to talk to your bishop about, who is this guy? Why is he up here? What did he do? And you can learn about some of that history and theology of that. So I think those things could be really useful. Could they lead to idolatry? Of course they could lead to idolatry. But I think they're not inherent and have to be... The question is more about how they're used and how do we teach what they do and what the value of them is, more than inherently just strike them and get rid of them.
Yeah. Cool. I'm going to jump a couple questions here because a conversation I'm really keen on having with you is about popular art.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you and I are both like huge fans of comic book films and graphic novels and video games and fantasy and sci-fi and all that. And I think I'm aware of... Well, in general, in our culture, I think there can kind of be just a looking down on those as like almost childish and trivial. Sure. But then I think in some Christian circles, there can be a view of those as like, well, that's just popcorn entertainment. It doesn't really have any eternal value, which I would disagree with. But I'm just curious on your thoughts on when it's something that's just like an Avengers movie.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's popcorn entertainment, but like, does that have value for a believer? And if so, what? Like, what's the importance of this sort of just popular entertainment?
So I think there's a number of things I could say. I think entertainment itself is not wrong. An overindulgence in entertainment, I think, is wrong.
Yeah.
But entertainment, the idea of having fun, isn't wrong. These things, so I'll separate it into two things. I think these things, again, we'll go to the idea of storytelling generally works to the promotion of a person, right? And well, I'll say the embetterment of a person. So I think you can see in most of these popular things a reality of the value of good things which have their basis ultimately in God, like courage, like maturity, like honesty, like wisdom, like learning. And I think you can see in these things a value in that. I think a danger can come in that most of these are going to portray that in a purely humanistic light.
Yeah.
Of doing it on your own.
Because they want to sell as much as they can.
Yeah, right, because they're not marketing to a Christian audience exclusively. But I think there's a reality of seeing those things as their value, but also identifying where they teach wrong. And that's the next thing I'll point at. I think a real value of popular media is popular media is both a lens and a driver of cultural understanding and cultural truth. If you look at the popular media, you can understand better the thoughts of the culture as a whole on a topic, right? So, I'm trying to think of an example that's not like bigly inflammatory. But
I don't know, pop music. Who's a popular musician? Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift. I don't know if that works for... Sure, Taylor Swift gives us this, right, kind of view of relationships and how they kind of work, which I'm not even going to say is necessarily right or wrong.
Right.
That'd be a different discussion. But by examining this, we can kind of look at how the culture views these things.
Right. And I think there's some raw depictions in there, too, where you can, like, see that and be like, oh, this maybe is not, like, an ideal to tout, but there is, like, a really... Even though it's all like very popular art, there is still kind of a real raw examination of at least her love life.
Yeah, and again, it's an examination of what's really happening. Right. And this is why, so I don't generally like stories, especially of established characters that are like backstories on the bad guys.
Yeah.
Like I said, I do like Wicked, so I do like some of these. But I feel for the most part of what these do is try to not justify, but explain
evil.
And in some ways mitigate evil.
Yeah.
And I think we lose something if you follow this popular art, and I think this is, again, a generally culture thing that people kind of believe, is that any evil can be explained away if you go back far enough. Of, hey, this guy was a big jerk, but his dad was abusive, and his dad was abusive because his dad was absent because he got killed by a murderer, and that murderer was angry because his dad was... Hey, the big problem with that is someone has to be evil in that.
Right.
In that, like, right?
It started somewhere.
Yeah, it started somewhere.
Yeah, eventually you'll just get back to Satan and be like, oh.
And I think you also lose the reality of, and again, I don't think people are always doing this, but like explaining, I think in some people's mind, explaining evil partially justifies evil.
Yeah.
So you can say, whoever this character is.
Joker,
sure.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the movie.
Or Cruella de Vil.
Yeah. We'll go with any of these people. What they did was wrong, but they did it because, and I think in a lot of people's minds but they did it because take some of the burden of the evil off of that person. And I think it shouldn't.
I think it almost comes from like the hyper subjectivity of where we are today, where it's like, at least here in America, for the most part, well, I shouldn't say for the most part, but a lot of people in the artistic world are very strongly believe whatever you believe is true, and that's your truth.
Yeah, that's a generally held, a widely, if not generally held belief. This is whatever you believe, at least in many issues, is true.
Yeah.
And I think it does come from that but I think we see it, and I think there is a value in saying, no, these things are, even if they're justified, even if they're not justified, even if they're explained, they're still wrong.
Right.
And so, like, I'll go to a very great non-Christian, but really is not Christian story, which is Les Mis. I genuinely struggle to believe that Victor Hugo is an atheist.
Me too.
Given the various stories he writes and how he writes and how he kind of works. But Jean Valjean, right, did something wrong, right? And he has a reason for it. He stole, he broke into a house and stole some bread. And there is a reason that he did it. He had to feed his sister's son. There is a reason behind it. That doesn't make it a morally acceptable or morally ambiguous action. It's still wrong for him to have done. But we see in this, he's treated wrongly. He's given way too long of a prison sentence. That's the whole premise of the story, right? But we see from this a growth out of a wrongness into a rightness and a restoration, because he's given forgiveness at the start of the story by the bishop and then ultimately by Christ. I think we can discuss. I think most people will accept that Jean Valjean is a Christian.
I mean, it's pretty corded. What he does.
But
he does have a whole song where he praise.
Yeah, by the bishop and then by Christ.
Yeah.
I think we can agree that he becomes a Christian. And it leads into a life that's changed to the point where he lets Javert go. Sorry, spoilers on Les Mis if you haven't seen it. It's been out for like 100 years, so I don't feel that bad. But he could have easily been justified or explained in a retaliation against Javert because he put him in prison. He was brutal to him, and then he followed him for decades just for essentially doing a thing that, again, was wrong, but was so minor that it can't possibly justify this response. Right. And he has genuinely a full opportunity to just do whatever revenge he wants. And he lets him go, and he shows him mercy. And I think that is a genuine growth of character that is different from simply explaining. If he had simply shot him in the face,
right,
you really have to call into question any growth he's had. Mm-hmm. And again, it would be explainable and understandable, but it wouldn't mitigate that it was a wrong thing to do. And it would really make you think, hey, after all this good, he's still willing to do this thing. Has he really grown at all? So I think that, again, that's all has to do with the idea that popular media gives you kind of a lens into the culture. Yeah. And then I think the Lord can do whatever he wants. Mm-hmm. So the Lord can use any media to his benefit. Yep. And the Lord can use like a person, like I will tell people, the jump off point from talking about Harry Potter to talking about Jesus is not a high dive. There are the story beats and kind of moral themes in Harry Potter I can lead that into a natural discussion about Christ. Yeah. So easily. I mean, I have said people before, maybe to the infuriament of big fans of Lewis. I'm a big fan of Lewis. But I think Harry Potter is a clearer Christ story than Narnia. I think there are arguably more allegorical elements in Harry Potter than Narnia. But I think these kind of things, the Lord can use this, even if it's not intended, right, as a teaching point for. I mean, like I said at the very start, Red Dead Redemption was not meant to inspire people about the coming beauty of heaven. Right. It just wasn't. I can say that with confidence. Mm-hmm. But the Lord used it in that way. Mm-hmm. Could have used something else? Sure, of course he could have used something else. I was actually kayaking out in nature like a week before, and the Lord did the same thing, right? Yeah. But the point is that he did use that art and non-Christian art in a way that was useful and God-leading in my life. Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting jumping-off point for the last question I'll ask before we try and wrap things up here. I, at least personally, have found God has kind of used art to nudge me in ways for spiritual formation, either in the act of creating art or seeing something. Like there's a moment in an Avengers movie that just constantly in my brain is like, this is an image in my mind of good faith in God.
Which one?
When Cap stares down Thanos. Okay,
sure, yeah.
I'm going to get to a geeky thing here, but sure, Captain America is established in the first Avengers movie to be a Christian, and then he never talks about it again.
Having some Christian values.
Right. Well, he at least says that he believes in one God.
Yes, yeah.
So he's either a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian.
Yes, a monotheist of some kind.
Yes.
Presumably, given that he's from the 1930s.
Most likely a Christian.
Most likely we can say something
right.
Christian.
And I think that's expanded on in the comics too. But then they like never touch on that again except for a joke in the second Avengers movie. But then when I'm watching Avengers Endgame, which they're like fighting this villain that's wiped out the universe basically. And they've like managed to get the universe back, but now they're facing him down again. And he's like, this time I'm going to just destroy this universe and start a new universe. So like Captain America has never seen anybody more powerful than this guy, and then he gets like totally beat up.
Yeah, sure.
And he's like, well, I'm going to just stand up and I'm just going to walk towards Thanos, and there's a whole army here. And I just, in my brain, it just made the jump to, oh, he's doing that because he knows there's something that is more powerful than Thanos.
Yeah.
Anyways, so I feel like art can be used to help strengthen your faith or help grow you towards Christ, but and God, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that, and if that's ever happened to you.
I mean, absolutely. Let's go with absolutely. God can use art to lead you to Him, right? And I'll point to, like I said, we're gonna keep back to it. I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan.
Yeah.
Great Divorce, which I mentioned earlier, is my favorite book. No qualifiers. And it's Lewis's art, and many others. I'll just stick with Lewis because I've been reading Lewis and I enjoy Lewis. Genuinely helps me think about and understand things in the Christian life better.
Yeah.
Now Lewis is easier because he's intended to, right?
Right.
The Great Divorce is intended to make you think about heaven, not like Red Dead Redemption, which was not intended. That's what the book is about.
Right.
The book is about examining kind of what do we think heaven is like, and kind of what misconceptions would a unsaved person have about heaven and hell and all these kind of. That's the point of the book.
Yeah.
But it does a good job at that point, and it does help me think about those things as it's going. I think other mediums can do the same thing. Actually, this is why we get, I think, depictions from popular media in sermons, right?
Yep.
Sermon illustrations are often, not always, obviously, but you often will hear, hey, it was in church this week or 2 weeks ago at my church. He referenced a Transformers movie.
Nice.
And he referenced how in the newer Transformer movie there is a Transformer god, he's called a god, who has to consume planets, and he was talking about how this is not a true depiction of God because the very fact that he has to consume means he's not a true God, right? But I think there's the one I've thought of recently is there's an Office episode where Michael burns his foot and then Dwight gets a concussion.
My brother is going to be just so happy for you to
there's an
expound
Office
on the
episode
value of
where,
The Office.
So the actual thing I was thinking of is they go to the hospital. Michael has a burn on his foot. Dwight has a concussion. And the doctor's looking at Dwight. And at one point, Michael asks the doctor, he goes, so what's more dangerous, a foot injury or a head injury? And the doctor goes, a head injury. And it actually made me think. So this is going somewhere.
Yeah.
It made me think as kind of a model of, if we go all the way back to Genesis 3, in the curse on the snake, when God is cursing the snake and, depending on your viewpoint, Satan,
right?
He says, you will strike his heel and he will crush your head. And people have rightly pointed out, those are the same words. The word for strike the heel and crush the head, same word in Hebrew. And some people I know have argued this to say, essentially, this just means they're going to fight. But, again, as The Office points out, a head injury is a bigger deal than a foot injury.
Yeah.
So the fact that the descendant of Eve, ultimately Jesus, is going to strike the head while his heel is getting struck, he wins.
Yeah.
Right? Just the reality of, if you injure someone's head and they injure your foot, you won the fight.
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking about this in The Office, unknowingly, makes that exact point, right? Is that Christ, in this Genesis 3 passage, is declaring the victory of Christ, not because Christ won't get injured at all. Obviously, Christ died.
Yeah, that's a pretty big injury.
That's a pretty big injury.
He had to press the respawn button.
As big as death is, it's actually not as big of an injury as Satan gets.
Yeah.
Because Satan gets irrevocably defeated.
Yeah.
Whereas Christ is back up in Adam in 3 days. But that point, again, is inadvertently made from The Office, and I think you can take that, very much not intended. I'm certain that when they were writing that episode of The Office, they were not thinking about how it related to the cursing of the snake in Genesis 3 and the prophecy about Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm certain that was not on their mind, but it is there. And being able to look at narrative and pictures and images and being able to think through how can God use this, and again, depictions of courage, of redemption. That's a big old throwback to the
Red
start.
Dead Redemption.
Yeah.
Which is a story about redemption.
It is a story about redemption. And not explicitly Christian redemption even, but this... I think you might be able to make a point. But these idea of these whole stories actually depict in a lot of ways, and I think this is kind of what my friend is going back to with his all Christians are story, is the nature that people on their own are not good.
Yeah.
Right? And again, a lot of these stories will go through the idea of improvement by one's own work, by one's own self. But I think, again, this idea that people are not good and need to become better is a very inherently Christian idea. Again, not on your own work in Christianity, but on we are not good and we need Christ because we're not good. I think those narrative points are not totally divorced, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. This has been a great discussion. I would love to keep going, but we are at an hour, so we should wind it to a close. I have one more question for you before we leave. If you could recommend a resource to a Christian artist who's either wanting to deepen their spiritual life or grow as an artist or both, what's one or a couple resources that you would recommend them to look into?
So one thing I would do genuinely is look into the work and life, but especially the work of other Christian artists who have come before you. So again, I'll just stick with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was genuinely a believer in Christ and genuinely made great literature and great narrative art.
Yep.
And just kind of seeing how... And it's an incredible life story. But seeing how he...
And had a great community of artists that he was a
part
of.
And a great community. Yeah, the Inklings are there, right? And most of them are Christians.
Yeah.
And being able to look in those, so maybe we can expand that to Tolkien and Barfoot and that kind of stuff, and say, hey, look at what they did in their art. What they did, what they didn't do, and what they did in their life. And kind of think about how does this... inform what I would do.
Yeah.
And then we can go all the way back if you really want to get the Psalms. Those are poems, man.
That's
those
art
are
in the
those
Bible.
are songs. That's art in the Bible. And again, looking at what is it driving at, and those are all in explicitly honoring God, or at least talking with God.
Right.
We can talk about.
There are points where he's just like, "Can you just kill my enemies?"
Yeah, right. There are imprecatory psalms, and even those teach a lot.
Yes, absolutely.
But looking at Christian artists' life and how they interacted with it, and how they interacted with other non-Christian art, and looking at, hey, here are. Again, this doesn't have to be Tolkien. You can go back and look at medieval painters. George MacDonald. You can talk at. I'm also thinking of Bach, right?
Yep.
Bach was a believer.
A lot of composers.
In that period. A lot of, and again, maybe this even goes to your type of art that you tend to
work so in. It could be Renaissance painters.
Yeah. Why is it that these people
Milton
did the things they did and didn't do the things they did?
Yeah.
And even modern day, right? They're like, heck, you can find interviews with Jonathan Rumi, or I know some people might not love his acting, but Kirk Cameron.
Yep.
And look at why do they do what they do and why don't they do it, and not just what is it that they do, but especially their thought process on what leads me to do this and not do this. Of like, again, Chronicles of Narnia was an experiment in what if I created a fictional world and then assumed Jesus also came to that world? How would it be the same and how would it be different? And that even thinking, I think, helped Lewis explore what he believed about Jesus, right? And it's different. It's different than the biblical story because in Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan comes to Narnia all the time.
Yep.
He comes a bunch of times. And that's different than the biblical story. But it also helps him think about what are the things I believe about the character of Jesus, and what are the things I believe about the narrative of these things and how they go on. And how does it look totally different? They're, allegory in Narnia, if you want to hold to it, really breaks down in later books because, like, what is the silver chair depicting other than the reality of sin and possession and this kind of stuff?
Right. I've always looked at it as less. I know there's the Planet Narnia theory too, but I feel like he just
I hold the Planet Narnia theory.
I think I haven't like done a lot of deep research. I think it makes sense from the little I've heard, but I like the idea that it seems like with each book he was like, what's a different aspect of like spiritual truth that I can really highlight and focus on?
Right. So I think he's highlighting. I will not argue for a second he's not using Jesus as a model for Aslan.
Right.
I don't think the story as a whole is allegorical, but that character.
Yes.
I think I just finished Prince Caspian. If you can read the end of Prince Caspian and not understand that Aslan is Jesus, you don't know enough about biblical imagery.
Yep.
Because if you know, and I mean, literally, I was reading it, it's insane. He's a lamb, and then he's a lion, and then he literally says there's like a curtain on the edge of the world, and he splits it, and they walk through. It's insane. He's there preparing fish on the side of a lake. It's literally like, if he's making sure that if anyone didn't get that Aslan's supposed to be Jesus, you have to be
really unfamiliar with Jesus
yeah. to understand it. He even says, "I exist in your world, and you have to get me know me there," and that kind of, like, it's very clear. But I think that using of, again, exploring, like you said, spiritual themes like possession and conversion and this kind of stuff in a setting that's totally different. Is a good way for the artist to think about the thing, and also think about the value of the art on the self, of how does the art not just help you depict
but how does
beauty
it help
and
shape
truth,
you?
but how does it help shape you?
Yeah.
In the very doing of the thing.
I know when I played Jesus, like, that has radically changed and is like a big turning point in my relationship with God and the Trinity, and just how I relate to him as my creator and father and brother.
And again, all that has to come back under the lens of the Bible, and is what you're believing actually true according to what we know is
Jesus,
true.
Or God is not actually a stage light that I looked at.
And not just your actual experience.
Yeah.
But I think it can help shape and inform, because even like our pastor at Calvary wrote a fantasy novel, and it's very much an allegory. And in it, there is a little bird who's the Holy Spirit who comes to the main character and empowers him and does all this kind of stuff. And again, that kind of imagery of how does this help you think about the Holy Spirit, not in a false way, but in a different way that helps you reveal truth.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what I tend to think of fiction, and not all art's fiction, but I tend to think of fiction as something untrue which reveals truth, right? At least good fiction is something that is not actually true. It didn't actually happen, but it does reveal real truth.
Right. And I think all art, I'll say this real quick and then we'll wrap up. I feel like all art is like, there's something otherworldly about it, because it's not like a conversation you're having with somebody. Even if you're listening to a song, this song's been done 1,000 times. It has music which is weird and abstract going on. But like, art should always be reflecting something that's truthful. You're always reflecting something towards your audience, even if it's either truthful or it's propaganda or it's
art is
demons.
Always saying something.
Yeah.
And part of the role of the viewer is to determine, is the thing it's saying true? Right.
And then you as a Christian artist, I think sometimes even just in your Christian belief being real to you, you may just inherently reflect, like if you're painting a mountain. You just by the fact that you know God created that may reflect that on people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And not in any, I also painted God up in the cloud. No, it's an inherent.
God's right here smiling about the mountain.
I think it's an inherent understanding that because I believe and honor and glorify God as creator, that will in some sense come out in the art.
Yeah.
And then it gives the opportunity to talk explicitly with people about that. So.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on to the podcast. This has been a lot of fun. I would love to have you on again. Awesome.
I live nearby. I can come by
there
again
we go.
Talk about Are video games art, and is Narnia an allegory?
I totally want to unpack video games as art and Christian art with you sometime.
I'm willing to do that.
So, if you enjoyed this podcast, give it a rating. Let me know. Share it. That really does help. John doesn't really do art, so you don't really need to like. I mean, he does, but like
not anything that you could like find.
Yeah,
on
you're not going to be able to look it up.
Not that.
But I mean, John's awesome, so just know that he's awesome. Anyways, thank you again, John, for coming on. Hope you all enjoyed this episode, and we will see you guys next time.